People were already betting on the end of the Duke of Ashcroft's marriage before the season had properly begun. Some placed their wagers in gentlemen's clubs hidden behind polished mahogany doors. Others whispered their predictions beneath crystal chandeliers while pretending to discuss music, weather, or charity committees. A few were bold enough to mention it openly in drawing rooms, confident that the Duchess herself would never hear them. They were wrong. Genevieve Ashcroft heard far more than society imagined. On a grey March afternoon in London, she stood beside a tall window in the drawing room of Lady Pembroke's townhouse and listened as two women discussed the future of her marriage as casually as they might discuss the price of imported tea. "I give it until June," one lady murmured behind her ivory fan. Victoria Holloway did not return to London for nothing. Her companion nodded. "You are too generous." "I say Easter. A man can only resist his true affection for so long." Genevieve continued looking through the glass toward the rain-damp street below. Her reflection stared back at her. Calm grey eyes. Dark blonde hair arranged with understated elegance. A face that had once been called beautiful but was now more often described as dignified. At 28 years old, she had learned that society preferred excitement over dignity. Especially when excitement involved a duke, a former sweetheart, and the possibility of scandal. Neither woman realized she stood close enough to hear every word. Neither woman noticed the faint smile that touched Genevieve's lips before disappearing again. She should have been angry. She should have felt humiliated. A proper wife, faced with such gossip, might have fled the room or confronted the offenders. Instead, Genevieve calmly lifted her teacup and took a sip. The tea had gone cold. She barely noticed. Across the room, Lady Pembroke was entertaining a cluster of guests near the fireplace. Their conversation drifted through the air in fragments. Politics. Investments. The upcoming spring season. And always, eventually, Victoria Holloway. Victoria had been back in London for exactly 12 days. 12 days had been enough to ignite rumours across every ballroom, opera house, and country estate in southern England. Genevieve could not remember another woman causing such excitement with a simple return from the continent. Then again, most women had not once been expected to marry Sebastian Ashcroft before fate intervened. Fate. Society loved that word. It made betrayal sound romantic and disappointment seem poetic. The truth was usually much less elegant. "Your Grace." A familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. Genevieve turned to find her younger brother approaching through the crowd. Theodore Hartwell was 2 years younger than she was and infinitely less skilled at concealing his emotions. Concern was written plainly across his face. "I have been looking for you." "Then your search has been successful." "Genevieve." He lowered his voice. "Have you heard what they are saying?" "Which particular rumor?" she asked. "There seem to be hundreds this week." Theodore frowned. "I am serious." "So am I." His expression tightened further. "I do not understand how you remained so calm." Genevieve glanced toward the women who had been discussing her marriage moments earlier. They immediately looked away. Perhaps because becoming upset would accomplish very little. Most wives would be furious. Most wives are not me. Theodore studied her carefully. "You know something." For the briefest moment, amusement flickered in her eyes. "Do I?" "Yes." He leaned closer. "I have known you my entire life. Whenever you become this calm, someone else should be worried." A soft laugh escaped her. "That is not a particularly flattering assessment of my character." "It is accurate." Before she could respond, a sudden shift in the room drew everyone's attention toward the entrance. Conversations faltered. Fans paused mid-motion. Even the servants seemed momentarily still. Genevieve followed the movement instinctively. Sebastian had arrived. The Duke of Ashcroft stood in the doorway, tall and composed in a dark evening coat that emphasized the broad line of his shoulders. At 34, he possessed the sort of presence that altered the atmosphere of a room simply by existing within it. Years of responsibility had sharpened his features rather than softened them. His dark hair was touched by the faintest hint of silver near the temples. His expression revealed almost nothing. Society had spent years trying to decipher Sebastian Ashcroft. Most had failed. Genevieve had once believed she understood him. Now she was not entirely certain. A path opened through the guests as people hurried to greet him. He acknowledged their welcomes with polite nods. Never rude. Never overly warm. Perfectly controlled. Always. His gaze swept the room. For one brief moment, it found hers. The contact lasted perhaps a second. Then he looked away. Something tightened deep inside her chest. It was not pain. Not anymore. Pain implied fresh wounds. This feeling was older than that. Quieter. More familiar. Like a scar that only a change in weather could awaken. Theodore noticed the exchange. There it is again. What? Genevieve asked. That look. You imagine too much. No. He shook his head. You still care for him. She said nothing. Silence could be more revealing than any answer. Theodore sighed. I wish he understood what he has. Genevieve lowered her gaze to her teacup. Perhaps he does. Then he has a strange way of showing it. That observation was difficult to argue against. Their marriage had begun with duty rather than passion. There had been mutual respect. Genuine friendship. Even moments of quiet happiness. Yet something essential had always remained just beyond reach. And over time, distance had settled between them like an invisible wall neither seemed capable of crossing. The arrival of Victoria Holloway threatened to make the distance impossible to ignore. Across the room, Sebastian was speaking with Lord Pembroke. Several young ladies hovered nearby, hoping for an introduction. He appeared unaware of their efforts. Or perhaps simply uninterested. That had always been Sebastian's way. Women noticed him. He rarely noticed them in return. Except, society insisted, for one woman. Victoria. Genevieve could almost hear the whispers forming already. The lost love returns. The Duke remembers his heart. The Duchess steps aside. People adored stories. Particularly tragic ones. They rarely cared whether those stories were true. I should leave, Theodore muttered. If I remain here much longer, I may challenge someone to a duel over careless gossip. Please do not. I am serious. That is exactly why you should not. He laughed despite himself. You are impossible. So I have been told. After he departed, Genevieve remained near the window. Rain continued to fall beyond the glass. Carriages rolled through wet streets. Footmen hurried beneath umbrellas. London carried on, indifferent to the dramas consuming its highest circles. A servant approached with a silver tray. Genevieve selected another cup of tea. As she did, a woman stepped into her path. Lady Beatrice Sutton. Known throughout society for her talent for appearing sympathetic while delivering insults. Your Grace. Beatrice offered a curtsy. You look remarkably well. Genevieve smiled politely. Thank you. I confess I expected you might remain in the country this season. Did you? Given recent developments. There it was. Not even disguised. Genevieve stirred her tea. I find London rather difficult to resist. Beatrice hesitated. Perhaps disappointed by the lack of reaction. Of course. Genevieve met her eyes. And I have never been in the habit of surrendering my place simply because others expect me to. A faint flush appeared on Beatrice's cheeks. Naturally. The woman excused herself moments later. Genevieve watched her go. Then she glanced across the room. Sebastian was still speaking with guests. Yet something unexpected happened. As if sensing her attention, he looked toward her again. This time the glance lasted slightly longer. Not enough for anyone else to notice. Long enough for her to feel it. A strange expression crossed his features. Curiosity, perhaps. Or concern. Then it vanished. Genevieve looked away first. Outside, the rain finally began to ease. Sunlight pushed weakly through clouds. The room brightened. Around her, conversations resumed their normal rhythm. Laughter returned. Rumors continued their endless migration from one corner of society to another. Yet beneath the surface, something was changing. Genevieve could feel it. Like the first distant tremor before a storm. Victoria Holloway believed she had returned to claim a victory that should have belonged to her years ago. Society expected a public humiliation. They expected tears, jealousy, and defeat. They expected a duchess desperately trying to save a failing marriage. Genevieve lowered her gaze to the delicate gold bracelet hidden beneath her sleeve. A small key hung from it. Few people had ever noticed. Fewer still understood its significance. Her fingers brushed the metal briefly. Then she released it. 3 years. 3 years of patience. 3 years of questions. 3 years spent waiting for the right moment. Across the room, another burst of laughter erupted at the mention of Victoria's name. Genevieve smiled to herself. Very few people understood what game was truly being played. And none of them realized that the woman they pitied had never been the one in danger. The carriage ride home was quiet. Not because there was nothing to say, but because some silences carried more weight than conversation. The streets of Mayfair glistened beneath the fading light of late afternoon. Rainwater reflected rows of elegant townhouses and flickering gas lamps that were beginning to awaken one by one as evening approached. Genevieve sat opposite her husband inside the Ashcroft carriage. The rhythmic sound of the wheels against wet cobblestones filled the space between them. Sebastian appeared absorbed in a document he had brought from the gathering. Whether he was actually reading it remained unclear. Genevieve looked through the window instead. Neither mentioned Lady Pembroke's reception. Neither mentioned Victoria Holloway. The omission itself felt significant. They arrived at Ashcroft House shortly before 6 o'clock. The London residence occupied a prestigious corner in Mayfair, its pale stone facade reflecting generations of wealth and influence. Uniformed footmen hurried forward as the carriage stopped. Moments later Genevieve stepped into the familiar entrance hall. Warmth greeted her immediately. The scent of polished wood, beeswax, and fresh flowers lingered in the air. Home. At least in appearance. Your Grace. The butler bowed respectfully. There is correspondence awaiting you in the morning room. Genevieve paused. Anything urgent? One letter arrived by special messenger this afternoon. Something in his expression made her pay closer attention. Thank you, Mr. Fletcher. Sebastian had already disappeared toward his study upstairs. She watched him go briefly before turning away. Once, years ago, he would have asked about her day. Once, she would have known exactly how his afternoon had passed. Strange how distance could grow gradually enough that neither person noticed until it had become impossible to ignore. The morning room overlooked a small private garden sheltered from the noise of London. Soft evening light filtered through tall windows. A silver tray waited on a nearby table. Several letters lay neatly arranged beside it. Genevieve crossed the room and examined the stack. Invitations. Charity requests. Household accounts. Then she saw the final envelope. Her hand froze. The paper was old. Not ancient, but old enough to stand apart from the others. Cream-colored. Slightly worn. No seal. No return address. Her heartbeat slowed rather than quickened. 3 years of preparation had taught her patience. She picked up the envelope carefully. The handwriting on the front belonged to someone long dead. For a moment she simply stared. Then she opened it. Inside was a folded sheet of paper. Another key. And a short message. Only 8 words. The package has arrived. The truth is waiting. Genevieve closed her eyes briefly. So. It had finally come. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Enter. The door opened and Theodore stepped inside. I hoped I would find you here. She smiled faintly. You seem to spend half your life looking for me lately. Someone has to. He stopped when he noticed her expression. What happened? Genevieve handed him the note. Theodore read it once. Then again. Who sent this? I do not know. You expected it? Yes. His gaze shifted to the small brass key resting beside the letter. Another key. Another key. Theodore sank into a nearby chair. Genevieve, there comes a point when mystery ceases to be intriguing and becomes deeply frustrating. A laugh escaped her. I imagine you crossed that point some time ago. Months ago. He leaned forward. Tell me what this means. She considered him for a moment. Theodore had earned honesty. More than anyone else, perhaps. Yet even now there were pieces she could not reveal. Not until she had proof. Not until the timing was right. Do you remember Lady Margaret Ellsworth? Theodore frowned. The widow from Bath. Yes. The one who died 3 years ago. Genevieve nodded. Theodore's confusion deepened. What does she have to do with any of this? Genevieve walked toward the window. Twilight settled over the garden outside. Shadows stretched across damp stone paths. Before her death, Lady Margaret entrusted something to me. What? Questions. Theodore blinked. Questions. Questions she believed someone wanted forgotten. Silence settled briefly between them. Theodore rose slowly. This has something to do with Victoria. Genevieve did not answer immediately. Perhaps. That means yes. He exhaled heavily. Good God. Do not sound so shocked. I am not shocked. I am horrified that you have apparently been conducting a secret investigation for 3 years while attending balls and charity events as though nothing was wrong. It sounds rather dramatic when you describe it that way. Because it is dramatic. For the first time all day, genuine amusement touched her features. Theodore pointed accusingly. There. That expression. That is exactly what worries me. I assure you I remain perfectly harmless. I have known you since birth. No one who looks that calm is harmless. Before Genevieve could respond, another knock sounded at the door. A maid entered carrying a silver tray. Your Grace. His Grace requests your presence at dinner this evening. Theodore immediately looked between them. That is unusual. It was. Sebastian often dined separately when business occupied him. Their schedules frequently overlapped. They also frequently did not. Thank you, Genevieve said. Please inform His Grace I shall join him. The maid curtsied and withdrew. Theodore waited until the door closed. Interesting. Do not start. I did not say anything. You were about to. Perhaps. Genevieve shook her head. Yet inwardly she felt the same surprise. Sebastian rarely made requests without reason. Especially lately. An hour later she entered the formal dining room. Candlelight illuminated polished silver and crystal. A fire burned quietly in the marble hearth. Sebastian was already seated at the far end of the table. He stood when she entered. Always polite. Always proper. Good evening. Good evening. She took her place opposite him. Servants appeared and disappeared with practiced efficiency. The first course arrived. Then the second. Conversation remained minimal. Not uncomfortable exactly. Merely cautious. As though both were navigating terrain neither fully understood. Finally Sebastian set down his wine glass. I heard Lady Pembroke hosted a successful gathering. Genevieve nearly smiled. Such an indirect approach. I believe she would consider it successful. Attendance seemed respectable. Very. A brief pause followed. Then he said, I imagine Victoria Holloway was discussed. There it was. Direct at last. Genevieve met his gaze calmly. Quite extensively. Something unreadable crossed his face. I see. You sound surprised. Not surprised. He looked away momentarily. Merely tired. That answer felt unexpectedly honest. She studied him more carefully. Shadows from the candlelight emphasized the strain around his eyes. For the first time she wondered whether the endless rumors frustrated him as much as they frustrated her. London enjoys speculation, she said quietly. London enjoys inventing entire lives for people it has never truly met. A faint smile appeared. Small but genuine. That may be the most accurate observation I have heard all week. The smile vanished almost immediately. Yet she had seen it. So had he. The awareness lingered between them. Neither acknowledged it. Dinner continued. Conversation shifted toward estate matters. Charitable projects. Parliament. Safe subjects. Familiar subjects. Yet something had changed. The wall between them remained. But perhaps, for one brief evening, a small crack had appeared. Later that night Genevieve sat alone in her private sitting room. A single lamp illuminated the desk before her. The old letter lay open beside the brass key. She removed a small wooden box from a locked drawer. Inside rested several documents collected over 3 years. Notes. Copies of correspondence. Fragments of a puzzle. Carefully she placed the newest message alongside the others. Then she unlocked another compartment hidden beneath the box's false bottom. A folded letter waited there. One she had read countless times. One she knew almost by heart. Yet tonight her eyes focused on a particular line. A single sentence written years earlier. If Victoria Holloway ever returns to London, follow the money. Genevieve stared at those words for a long moment. Outside, distant carriage wheels echoed through the night. Somewhere beyond the city, the final piece of evidence was waiting. And for the first time in 3 years, she could feel it moving toward her. By the end of the week, London had decided that Victoria Holloway's return was no longer a rumour. It had become an event. Invitations arrived daily. Luncheons, musicales, charity galas, private dinners, and garden parties all seemed to revolve around a single topic. Every hostess wanted Victoria present. Every guest wanted to witness what might happen when Victoria Holloway and the Duchess of Ashcroft occupied the same room. Society claimed to value dignity. In truth, it adored spectacle. On Thursday morning, Genevieve sat in the breakfast room reviewing household correspondence when Mr. Fletcher appeared carrying a silver salver. Another invitation, Your Grace. She accepted the envelope. The seal belonged to Lady Worthington, one of the most influential hostesses in London. Genevieve broke it open. Theodore, who had arrived unexpectedly half an hour earlier and was currently helping himself to a second serving of breakfast, watched her carefully. Well. She handed him the card. He scanned it quickly. The Worthington Spring Ball. Theodore groaned. Of course. What troubles you? Only the fact that every ambitious woman in England will attend. He looked up. Including Victoria. Genevieve reached for her tea. Almost certainly. Theodore continued reading. Good Lord. Lady Worthington expects more than 400 guests. She always does. This is not a ball. It is a military campaign disguised as entertainment. Genevieve laughed softly. Theodore pointed toward the invitation. Do not laugh. You know I am right. In many ways, he was. The Worthington Ball marked the unofficial beginning of the most important social period of the season. Alliances formed there. Courtships began there. Reputations rose and fell beneath those chandeliers. If someone wished to make a statement to London society, there were few better stages. The realization settled heavily between them. Theodore lowered the invitation. She is going to do something. Genevieve remained calm. Who? Victoria. That is hardly a revelation. You know what I mean. Theodore leaned forward. She did not return to London merely to attend concerts and discuss embroidery. I should hope not. It sounds terribly dull. Genevieve. Yes? You are impossible. Before she could answer, another servant entered carrying a small tray. Upon it rested a single calling card. Genevieve accepted it. The name written in elegant script caused her expression to sharpen slightly. Theodore noticed immediately. What is it? She handed him the card. His eyes widened. Victoria called here. Yesterday afternoon, apparently. You were not home. No. Theodore looked disturbed. Why would she visit? Genevieve studied the card. A faint fragrance lingered on the paper. Expensive perfume. Deliberately chosen. Deliberately memorable. To announce her presence, Genevieve said quietly. Theodore stared at her. You sound as though she is preparing for battle. Genevieve folded the card and set it aside. Perhaps she is. Later that afternoon, Genevieve visited a charitable society in Bloomsbury. Public appearances remained important. More importantly, they allowed observation. Society revealed itself most freely when it believed it was discussing someone who was not present. As she entered the assembly hall, conversations immediately shifted. Not enough to appear rude. Just enough to be noticed. She had grown accustomed to it. Across the room, Lady Beatrice Sutton was already entertaining a small audience. Their voices lowered the moment Genevieve approached. Your Grace, Beatrice said brightly. How wonderful to see you. Lady Beatrice. Have you heard? Genevieve smiled inwardly. That question usually indicated gossip was about to follow. Heard what? Victoria Holloway has accepted Lady Worthington's invitation. Several women exchanged excited glances. Has she? Genevieve asked. Indeed. Beatrice lowered her voice. People are saying it will be the event of the season. Another woman added eagerly, everyone will be watching. Genevieve knew precisely what they meant. Everyone would be watching her. Waiting for signs of jealousy. Fear. Desperation. The reactions they expected from a woman whose marriage was supposedly under threat. Instead she simply nodded. Then I am certain Lady Worthington will be pleased. The disappointment that followed was almost amusing. Beatrice clearly hoped for something more dramatic. Fortunately, Genevieve had no intention of providing entertainment. The meeting continued. Charitable budgets were discussed. Donations organized. Future projects planned. Yet throughout the afternoon she remained aware of curious glances. The season had transformed her into a spectator sport. The irony was that most observers understood almost nothing. By the time she returned to Ashcroft House, dusk had begun settling over London. Gas lamps glowed along the streets. Carriages rolled past in steady streams. Inside the house, warmth and quiet greeted her. She had just removed her gloves when Mr. Fletcher approached. Your Grace, a gentleman called while you were away. Genevieve paused. Did he leave a name? Mr. Nathaniel Price. For the first time all day, genuine surprise crossed her face. Nathaniel Price. Lady Margaret Ellsworth's former solicitor. A man who had vanished from London nearly 2 years earlier. Did he leave a message? Mr. Fletcher handed her a folded note. Genevieve opened it immediately. The message was brief. Meet me tomorrow. The information cannot wait. She read it twice. Then a third time. Her pulse remained steady, but something deeper stirred. Anticipation. Concern. Hope. 3 years of searching had produced fragments. Questions. Possibilities. Never certainty. Perhaps that was about to change. Your Grace? Mr. Fletcher asked gently. She folded the note. Thank you. That will be all. Once alone, she crossed to the nearest window. Night had fully arrived. Reflections shimmered across the glass. Her own face looked back at her. Calm. Controlled. Patient. Yet beneath that composure, thoughts moved rapidly. If Nathaniel Price had returned, something significant had happened. He would not risk exposure otherwise. A knock sounded behind her. She turned. Sebastian stood in the doorway. For a moment neither spoke. The quiet felt oddly familiar. As though they were remembering how to exist in the same space again. I hope I am not interrupting, he said. Not at all. His gaze shifted briefly toward the note in her hand. Then back to her face. I came regarding Lady Worthington's ball. Of course. The ball. The centre of every conversation in London. What about it? He hesitated. A rare occurrence. I wish to confirm that you intend to attend. Genevieve studied him carefully. Do you? Yes. The answer came immediately. Then so do I. Something unreadable flickered across his expression. Relief perhaps. Or concern. Very well. He seemed about to leave. Then he stopped. Genevieve. The sound of her name in his voice felt unexpectedly intimate. Not because of affection. Because he used it so rarely now. Yes? The next few weeks may be unpleasant. She waited. London can be cruel when it senses weakness. For several seconds she simply looked at him. The statement carried more meaning than either acknowledged. At last she said, "Fortunately, I have never been particularly weak." The faintest hint of a smile touched his face. No. You have not. Then he left. Genevieve remained by the window long after the door closed. Outside, the city continued its endless movement. Inside, her thoughts returned to Nathaniel Price. To Lady Margaret. To the letter hidden inside her locked box. To Victoria Holloway. Somewhere within those connections lay the truth she had spent 3 years pursuing. And for the first time, she sensed that the game was accelerating. Meanwhile, elsewhere in London, another woman was preparing her own strategy. Victoria Holloway had not crossed an ocean and returned to England for nostalgia. She had come with a purpose. Soon enough, all of London would discover what that purpose truly was. The Worthington Ball was only days away. And before the first waltz even began, the season had already become a war disguised as courtesy. The Worthington Ball began long before the first carriage arrived. By noon, London was already discussing it. By 4 o'clock, every fashionable drawing room seemed occupied by women selecting gowns and men pretending they were not interested in the evening ahead. By 8 o'clock, the city had transformed anticipation into spectacle. Hundreds of carriage lamps illuminated the broad avenue leading to Worthington House. Music drifted from open windows. Laughter echoed beneath the spring night sky. The grand townhouse blazed with light from top to bottom. Crystal chandeliers illuminated marble floors polished to perfection. Fresh flowers adorned every available surface. Uniformed servants moved with military precision through crowds of aristocrats eager to see and be seen. Genevieve stood before the mirror in her dressing room at Ashcroft House while her maid completed the final adjustments to her gown. The silver blue silk reflected candlelight softly. Elegant rather than dramatic. Refined rather than attention-seeking. The sort of gown chosen by a woman comfortable with her place in society. Or perhaps by a woman who no longer needed society's approval. "You look beautiful, Your Grace," the maid said sincerely. Genevieve smiled. "Thank you, Hannah." The maid hesitated. Then, like nearly everyone else in London, she finally asked the question she had clearly been holding back. "Will Miss Holloway be there tonight?" Genevieve met the young woman's eyes in the mirror. "I imagine she will." Hannah looked concerned. "People are talking. People are always talking. Not like this." Genevieve rose from her chair. "Then perhaps they will find a new subject tomorrow." Moments later she descended the main staircase. Sebastian was waiting in the entrance hall. For a brief second he simply looked at her. The expression vanished so quickly she almost believed she had imagined it. Yet she did not think she had. "You look lovely this evening," he said. The compliment surprised her. Not because it was unwelcome. Because it was genuine. "Thank you." He offered his arm. "Shall we?" The journey to Worthington House took less than 20 minutes. Neither spoke much during the ride. Yet the silence felt different from earlier weeks. Less distant. Less cold. As though both had become aware of a bridge neither had realized still existed. When they arrived, the scale of the gathering became immediately apparent. The entrance hall overflowed with guests. The ballroom beyond glittered beneath countless candles. Music filled the air. The orchestra played a lively waltz while couples moved across the polished floor. Conversations paused as the Duke and Duchess of Ashcroft entered. Not entirely. Just enough. Genevieve felt the shift immediately. The room was watching. Sebastian undoubtedly noticed as well. If he did, he showed no sign. Together they moved through the crowd, greeting acquaintances and exchanging polite conversation. Yet beneath every interaction lingered the same unspoken question. Where was Victoria Holloway? Nearly an hour passed before the answer arrived. Genevieve was speaking with Lady Worthington near one of the ballroom's enormous windows when a sudden ripple moved through the crowd. It began near the entrance, then spread outward like a stone dropped into still water. Heads turned. Conversations faltered. Fans paused. Even the musician seemed to hesitate for a fraction of a second. Lady Worthington sighed. And there she is. Genevieve looked toward the doorway. Victoria Holloway stood framed beneath the chandelier's golden light. She was undeniably beautiful. Dark hair. Perfect posture. A deep crimson gown designed to attract attention from the instant she entered a room. It succeeded admirably. Every eye followed her. Every whisper intensified. Victoria appeared entirely aware of the effect. Her smile suggested satisfaction rather than embarrassment. She moved through the crowd with effortless confidence, stopping occasionally to greet acquaintances, accepting compliments, encouraging admiration. The performance was flawless, until her gaze found Sebastian. The room seemed to hold its breath. Genevieve felt it happen. Not because of emotion, because hundreds of other people felt it too. Victoria smiled. Then she began walking directly toward them. Lady Worthington muttered something under her breath and discreetly retreated. Genevieve could hardly blame her. Victoria approached gracefully. Sebastian turned as she arrived. For a brief moment nobody spoke. Then Victoria curtsied. Your Grace. Her eyes remained fixed on Sebastian. It has been a very long time. Sebastian inclined his head politely. Miss Holloway. Nothing more. Nothing less. The exchange should have ended there. It did not. Victoria's smile widened. I was beginning to wonder if London had changed you. London changes very little. That is true. Her gaze shifted briefly toward Genevieve. Some things remain exactly where they were. The implication was subtle enough to maintain propriety. Obvious enough for everyone nearby to understand. Genevieve merely smiled. Welcome back to England, Miss Holloway. Victoria looked almost disappointed by the civility. You are very kind. Not particularly. The silence that followed carried an edge. Then another guest arrived. Conversation resumed. Victoria eventually drifted away. Yet the tension remained. Throughout the next hour she seemed to appear wherever Sebastian happened to be. At first the encounters looked accidental. Then increasingly less so. She joined conversations already in progress. Positioned herself nearby during dances. Found reasons to speak to mutual acquaintances. None of it violated etiquette. All of it attracted attention. Genevieve observed calmly. She noticed more than most people realized. She noticed Sebastian growing increasingly uncomfortable. She noticed Victoria becoming bolder. Most importantly, she noticed the audience. London loved narratives. Tonight the narrative was writing itself before their eyes. Shortly before midnight, the orchestra announced a new waltz. Couples gathered eagerly near the dance floor. The crowd shifted. Voices rose. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light across swirling silk and polished black coats. Genevieve stood near a marble column speaking with Theodore, who looked ready to strangle half the ballroom. I dislike this woman more every minute, he muttered. Try not to look so murderous. I am attempting restraint. Poorly. Theodore opened his mouth to reply. Then stopped. His expression changed instantly. Genevieve followed his gaze. Across the ballroom, Victoria had approached Sebastian once again. They stood near the edge of the dance floor surrounded by dozens of guests. At first nothing appeared unusual. Then Victoria stepped closer. Too close. Sebastian frowned slightly. He seemed about to say something. Before he could, Victoria reached up. Gasps erupted from nearby spectators. Time seemed to slow. The ballroom froze. Conversations vanished. Music continued for perhaps 2 more notes before even the orchestra faltered. In full view of London society, Victoria pressed a brief kiss against Sebastian's cheek. It lasted only a moment. Nothing improper by modern standards. Everything improper by theirs. Shock rippled through the room. Yet the act itself was not what transformed the moment into scandal. It was what happened immediately afterward. Victoria turned her head. Her eyes found Genevieve across the crowded ballroom. And she smiled. Deliberately. Triumphantly. As though issuing a challenge before hundreds of witnesses. Silence spread through the room. Everyone looked at the Duchess of Ashcroft. Every aristocrat. Every debutante. Every ambitious mother. Every gossip. Every observer who had spent weeks anticipating exactly this possibility. They waited. They expected outrage. Tears. Humiliation. A dramatic departure. Some sign that the wound had landed. Theodore went rigid beside her. Across the ballroom, Sebastian looked genuinely stunned for perhaps the first time in years. Victoria remained perfectly still. Waiting. Watching. The entire room waited with her. And for the first time that evening, Genevieve finally smiled. Not the polite smile of a duchess fulfilling social obligations. Not the distant smile she used to survive London's endless scrutiny. This smile was different. Calm. Certain. Almost amused. Which was precisely why a chill passed through Victoria Holloway's expression for the first time that night. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. The silence that settled over the ballroom felt almost physical. Hundreds of people stood suspended between shock and anticipation. The orchestra remained frozen. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the servants seemed uncertain whether they should continue moving through the crowd. Every eye remained fixed on Genevieve. Theodore's hand tightened around the stem of his champagne glass. Tell me I imagined that. Genevieve did not take her eyes off Victoria. You did not. Good God. Language. This is not the time. Across the ballroom, Sebastian still appeared stunned. Victoria's smile remained firmly in place. Yet something had shifted. It was subtle. Barely visible. The certainty behind her expression had weakened. Only slightly. Because Genevieve had not reacted the way she expected. Most women would have. Most wives would have. That was Victoria's mistake. Genevieve slowly set down her fan. Then she began walking. The crowd parted instinctively. Guests stepped aside without realizing they were doing it. A pathway opened through the center of the ballroom. Victoria's smile brightened as Genevieve approached. Clearly she believed a confrontation was finally coming. The audience believed it as well. Theodore muttered something that sounded suspiciously like a prayer. Genevieve continued forward. Her posture remained graceful. Her expression remained composed. Not a trace of humiliation appeared on her face. By the time she reached the center of the ballroom, even the musicians were watching. Sebastian looked at her carefully. There was concern in his eyes now. Genuine concern. Perhaps he expected anger. Perhaps he feared he deserved it. Genevieve stopped several feet away. Victoria lifted her chin. Your Grace. Miss Holloway. Another silence followed. This one even more dangerous. Then Genevieve did something that nobody expected. She reached for a champagne flute resting on a nearby tray. The servant nearly dropped it from surprise. Calmly she raised the glass. The gesture instantly attracted everyone's attention. Miss Holloway, Genevieve said clearly enough for those nearest to hear. The room strained to listen. Allow me to offer my congratulations. Victoria blinked. Just once. It was the first genuine crack in her confidence. My congratulations? Of course. Genevieve's smile remained perfectly pleasant. Very few people possess the courage required to create such excitement in a single evening. A ripple moved through the crowd. Several guests exchanged confused glances. Others looked openly fascinated. Victoria laughed lightly. You are very generous. Not at all. Genevieve raised her glass slightly higher. After all, an ordinary entrance would never have inspired this much discussion. A few nearby guests struggled to conceal smiles. Victoria's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. She had expected jealousy. She had expected outrage. Instead, she was being treated like an entertainer who had successfully performed for an audience. Genevieve continued. London has been rather bored lately. You have provided a valuable service. Somewhere behind them, someone choked on champagne. Theodore immediately turned away to hide his face. Sebastian stared at his wife with an expression Genevieve had not seen in years. It looked suspiciously like admiration. Victoria's smile grew thinner. I am delighted to have been useful. Indeed. Genevieve lifted her glass in a formal toast. To Miss Holloway. May she continue to exceed expectations. This time laughter escaped several people before they could stop themselves. Not cruel laughter. Uncertain laughter. The sort that appeared when an audience suddenly realized it had misunderstood the performance. Victoria accepted her own champagne glass from a servant. Her fingers tightened around the stem. To unexpected evenings, she replied. Their glasses touched lightly. The sound echoed through the silence. Then Genevieve drank. Victoria followed a second later. The duel ended before most people realized one had taken place. Yet everyone felt the outcome. The atmosphere had changed. Completely. Victoria had attempted to place Genevieve in the position of wounded wife. Genevieve had refused the role. Instead, she had transformed the moment into something else entirely. The crowd no longer knew what story it was watching. That uncertainty spread rapidly. Conversation returned. Music resumed. Guests began speaking again. Yet the energy remained different. Curious. Unsettled. The expected scandal had somehow slipped beyond their grasp. Genevieve turned to leave. Sebastian stepped forward immediately. Genevieve. She paused. Yes? For a moment he seemed uncertain what to say. Are you all right? The question surprised her more than it should have. Not because of the words. Because of the sincerity behind them. Perfectly. His gaze searched her face. You do not appear upset. Should I? Something almost resembling a smile touched his mouth. Most people would be. Most people were not married to me. The answer caught him off guard. She saw it happen. A brief flicker of amusement appeared in his eyes. Then it disappeared. Yet the moment lingered. Neither mentioned it. Theodore arrived seconds later. I would like it officially recorded that I have absolutely no idea what just happened. Genevieve laughed. Nothing happened. That is a lie. Theodore glanced toward Victoria. Something definitely happened. Sebastian surprised both of them by speaking first. I agree. Theodore looked delighted. You see? Genevieve shook her head. Both of you are being dramatic. Says the woman who just dismantled an entire scandal using a champagne toast. Theodore lowered his voice. You frightened her. Nonsense. You did. Theodore glanced toward Victoria again. She expected tears. Perhaps. Instead she looked confused. Genevieve said nothing. Theodore leaned closer. You know something. You keep saying that. Because it keeps being true. Before she could respond, a familiar voice interrupted. Your Grace. Genevieve turned. An elderly gentleman stood nearby. Lord Hensley. One of the oldest and most respected peers in attendance. My lord. He bowed slightly. Permit me to say that your composure this evening has been extraordinary. Genevieve smiled politely. You are kind. No. Lord Hensley shook his head. Merely observant. His gaze drifted briefly toward Victoria. Very observant. Then he moved away. More guests approached afterward. Some offered compliments. Others simply wished to speak. The attention itself was unusual. For years Genevieve had occupied the comfortable but largely invisible position expected of a duchess. Tonight that invisibility had vanished. Not because she demanded attention. Because she had mastered it. Across the ballroom, Victoria remained surrounded by admirers. Yet something fundamental had changed. Her triumph no longer appeared complete. People continued watching her. But they were also watching Genevieve now. Comparing. Evaluating. Reconsidering. Exactly as Genevieve intended. Nearly an hour later, as the evening drew closer to its end, Genevieve stepped onto a quiet balcony overlooking the garden. Cool spring air greeted her. The noise of the ballroom softened behind closed doors. For the first time all night, she was alone. Or so she thought. I wondered where you had gone. Sebastian's voice came from behind her. She turned. He stepped onto the balcony. Moonlight silvered the edges of his dark coat. Neither spoke immediately. The quiet felt surprisingly comfortable. You handled tonight remarkably well, he said at last. Genevieve looked toward the gardens below. Did I? You know you did. She smiled faintly. Perhaps. Sebastian studied her profile. Most people would not have remained so calm. You seem determined to convince me that I am unusual. You are unusual. The answer came without hesitation. For reasons she could not fully explain, the words affected her. More than they should have. More than she wanted. She looked away before he could notice. Neither saw the figure standing inside the ballroom near the doorway. Victoria Holloway watched them through the glass. Her expression remained pleasant. Elegant. Controlled. Yet behind the smile, concern had begun to emerge. Because for the first time since her return to London, something no longer made sense. The Duchess of Ashcroft was not behaving like a woman under attack. She was behaving like a woman who had been waiting for the attack to begin. And that realization frightened Victoria far more than anger ever could. Sebastian Ashcroft had spent most of his adult life trusting his judgment. It was one of the reasons he had become successful. It was also one of the reasons the previous evening continued to trouble him. 3 days after the Worthington ball, he stood alone in his study staring at a ledger without reading a single line. The account figures blurred together. His thoughts remained elsewhere. Specifically, they remained fixed on his wife. He had expected anger. Anyone would have. He had expected wounded pride, perhaps even a confrontation. Instead, Genevieve had calmly transformed a public embarrassment into a victory. More troubling still, she had seemed prepared for it. The realization refused to leave him. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Enter. His secretary stepped inside carrying several documents. The contracts from Yorkshire, Your Grace. Sebastian accepted them automatically. Thank you. The young man hesitated. May I ask a question? Sebastian looked up. That depends on the question. Is London always this dramatic? Despite himself, Sebastian almost smiled. Unfortunately. Everyone is still discussing the ball. Sebastian returned his attention to the papers. I imagined they would be. The secretary shifted awkwardly. Most people seem impressed by the Duchess. Sebastian paused. Then he nodded once. As they should be. The answer surprised both of them. After the secretary departed, silence returned to the study. Yet something lingered. As they should be. The words echoed in his mind. He had spoken them instinctively. Without calculation. Without consideration. Because they were true. The realization unsettled him more than he wished to admit. Meanwhile, several miles away, Genevieve sat inside a modest townhouse in Bloomsbury. Unlike the grand residences of Mayfair, this neighborhood attracted little attention from fashionable society. That was precisely why she preferred it. Nathaniel Price waited for her in a private sitting room. The former solicitor appeared older than she remembered. More tired. Yet his eyes remained sharp. He rose immediately when she entered. "Your Grace." "Mr. Price." He waited until the servant withdrew before speaking again. "Thank you for coming." Genevieve removed her gloves. "Your note suggested urgency." It did. Nathaniel crossed the room and retrieved a small leather portfolio from a locked cabinet. 3 years ago, Lady Margaret asked me to safeguard certain records. Genevieve's attention sharpened instantly. Records concerning Victoria Holloway. Partially. He handed her the portfolio. "The problem is not what these documents reveal." "What is the problem?" Nathaniel's expression darkened. "What they imply." Genevieve opened the portfolio. Several letters rested inside. Financial statements. Correspondence. Receipts. Nothing appeared remarkable at first glance. Then she noticed a name. Her breath caught. Not because the name was unfamiliar. Because it was impossible. Slowly she looked up. "This cannot be correct. I checked 6 times. Nathaniel's voice remained steady. "Then I hired another solicitor to verify my findings." Genevieve stared at the page. "And?" "He reached the same conclusion." Silence settled over the room. Outside, carriage wheels rattled faintly along distant streets. Inside, Genevieve's entire understanding of the puzzle shifted. One missing piece had finally fallen into place. Yet the new picture raised even more questions than before. "Does anyone else know?" she asked quietly. "Not yet." Nathaniel sat opposite her. "I thought you should see it first." Genevieve closed the portfolio carefully. "You were right." For several moments neither spoke. Then Nathaniel said, "The ball appears to have accelerated matters." She met his gaze. "You heard about it?" "The entire city heard about it." A faint smile touched his face. "From what I understand, you handled yourself rather well." Genevieve laughed softly. "London tends to exaggerate." "Not this time." Nathaniel leaned forward. "Your Grace, if Victoria believes she has control of the situation, she may become careless." The possibility had already occurred to Genevieve. Carelessness created opportunities. Opportunities created mistakes. And mistakes revealed truth. "I hope you are right," she said. "I am." Nathaniel hesitated. "There is one more thing." "What?" He reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded note. "This arrived yesterday." Genevieve accepted it. The handwriting was unfamiliar. Yet the message was startlingly brief. "She knows someone is watching." Nothing more. No signature. No explanation. Yet the meaning was obvious. Victoria had become suspicious. Genevieve folded the note carefully. "Interesting." Nathaniel studied her. "That is not the reaction I expected." "What reaction did you expect?" "Concern." Genevieve smiled faintly. "Concern is useful only when it produces action." "And does it?" "No." She placed the note inside the portfolio. "But information does." Across London, Victoria Holloway sat inside an elegant drawing room surrounded by admirers. The gathering looked informal. The conversation sounded harmless. Yet Victoria paid little attention to either. Her thoughts remained elsewhere. Specifically, they remained fixed on Genevieve Ashcroft. A young woman seated nearby laughed. "You certainly captured everyone's attention at the ball." Several guests smiled. Victoria returned the smile automatically. "That was never my intention." Nobody believed her. Not even slightly. Another woman leaned forward. The Duchess surprised everyone. Victoria's expression remained unchanged. "Did she?" "Absolutely." The woman laughed. "Most people expected tears." Victoria lowered her teacup carefully. Most people underestimate her. The words escaped before she could stop them. A strange silence followed. Not because the statement sounded unusual. Because it sounded sincere. Victoria quickly redirected the conversation elsewhere. Yet the damage had been done. She had underestimated Genevieve. Repeatedly. The realization irritated her more than she liked. Later that evening, Genevieve returned home carrying the portfolio concealed inside a simple leather satchel. Ashcroft House remained quiet. A fire crackled softly in the library. Somewhere upstairs a grandfather clock marked the passing hours. She intended to go directly to her private sitting room. Instead she stopped. Sebastian stood near the library fireplace reading a newspaper. He looked up when she entered. "You are home later than expected." "I had business in Bloomsbury." "I see." The answer should have ended the conversation. Yet neither moved. The silence stretched. Not uncomfortable. Merely thoughtful. Sebastian folded the newspaper. "May I ask you something?" Genevieve looked surprised. "Of course." He hesitated. Once again. The second time in a week. "What happened at the ball?" The question was not what she expected. "You were there." "I know." His gaze remained fixed on hers. "That is not what I mean." Understanding slowly dawned. He was not asking about Victoria. He was asking about her. "Why did you react the way you did?" Genevieve considered the question carefully. At last she said, "Because some battles are won before they begin." Sebastian stared at her. That sounds like something a general would say. "Perhaps I missed my calling." To her surprise, he laughed. The sound was brief. Genuine. Unexpected. It transformed his entire face. For a moment he looked years younger. Less burdened. Less distant. Genevieve found herself staring. Then the moment passed. Yet neither seemed eager to leave. Genevieve. Her name sounded different now. Softer somehow. "Yes?" Sebastian studied her carefully. "I think there is something you are not telling me." The observation struck dangerously close to the truth. "I am certain there are many things I have not told you." "You know what I mean." She held his gaze. "Do I?" A faint smile appeared. There it is again. "What?" That expression. His eyes narrowed slightly. The one that suggests you know exactly what is happening while the rest of us struggle to keep pace. Genevieve felt laughter threaten. That sounds terribly arrogant. It sounds accurate. For several seconds they simply looked at each other. Then a servant entered carrying correspondence. The moment dissolved immediately. Reality returned. Responsibilities returned. Distance returned. Yet as Genevieve climbed the staircase later that night, she could not ignore a growing certainty. The investigation was progressing faster than ever before. Victoria was becoming uneasy. Nathaniel had uncovered evidence that changed everything. And Sebastian was beginning to ask questions. For 3 years she had waited patiently. For 3 years she had moved pieces into position. Now, at last, the game itself had truly begun. 3 years earlier, Genevieve had not been searching for secrets. She had been searching for answers. There was a difference. Secrets implied intention. Answers implied confusion. At the time, confusion seemed far more likely. The memory returned to her often now. Especially on nights when the house had fallen silent and the distance between herself and Sebastian felt impossible to measure. It had begun during the final weeks of Lady Margaret Ellsworth's life. Lady Margaret had been one of the few women in London who possessed both extraordinary intelligence and absolutely no interest in social approval. At 72, she had earned the freedom to speak honestly. Most people found that unsettling. Genevieve had found it refreshing. 3 years ago, on a rainy afternoon in Bath, Genevieve visited the elderly widow during what everyone assumed would be their final meeting. The illness itself was not severe. Age simply had its own timetable. Lady Margaret sat beside a window overlooking a small garden washed silver by spring rain. A blanket covered her knees. Several books rested nearby. Her sharp blue eyes remained unchanged. "You look tired," the older woman observed. Genevieve laughed softly. "You always begin with uncomfortable truths. Because pleasant lies waste time." Genevieve settled into the chair opposite her. "Then I suppose I should thank you for your efficiency." Lady Margaret smiled. "Your marriage troubles you." The statement was so direct that Genevieve nearly laughed again. "You truly have no patience for subtlety." "None whatsoever." Lady Margaret adjusted the blanket. "Do not worry. I am not asking whether your husband loves you." Genevieve lowered her gaze. "That is fortunate. I am asking whether you trust him." The question struck far deeper. Trust. Such a simple word. Yet the answer refused to come easily. "I believe he is honorable," Genevieve said at last. "That is not the same thing." No. It was not. Lady Margaret watched her carefully. "You are wondering about the letters." Genevieve went completely still. Very few people knew about the letters. Fewer still knew how deeply they had influenced the course of her marriage. "How did you know?" Lady Margaret smiled faintly. "Because I am old. People tell old women everything. They assume we are no longer paying attention." Rain tapped gently against the glass. Genevieve felt a strange unease settle inside her. "What exactly have you heard?" "Enough." The older woman reached toward a small table beside her chair. There she retrieved a folded piece of paper. "Tell me, did you ever find it strange?" Genevieve accepted the paper. "Find what strange?" "The timing." Slowly she unfolded it. Her breath caught. The handwriting belonged to Sebastian. Or appeared to. She recognized it immediately. Yet something felt wrong. Subtly wrong. The shape of certain letters. The spacing between words. Tiny inconsistencies that most people would never notice. "Where did this come from?" she asked quietly. Lady Margaret's expression hardened. "That is the correct question." Genevieve looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "I mean that some correspondence is genuine." Lady Margaret leaned forward. "And some is merely convincing." Silence settled between them. Outside, the rain continued falling. Inside, Genevieve felt the first tremor of a possibility she had never previously considered. "You believe someone altered letters?" "I believe someone benefited from confusion." The older woman held her gaze. "That is not the same thing." Genevieve looked back at the paper. Her thoughts raced. During the first years of her marriage, there had been letters. Misunderstandings. Delays. Messages that never seemed to arrive at the correct moment. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. Simply enough small disappointments to create distance. At the time she had blamed circumstance. Now she was no longer certain. "Who?" she whispered. Lady Margaret shook her head. "That is the question I could never answer." "Then why tell me?" The older woman smiled sadly. "Because you are one of the few people I trust to ask the right questions." Several weeks later, Lady Margaret died peacefully in her sleep. Most people remembered her fortune. Her wit. Her eccentric habits. Genevieve remembered the paper. And the questions. At first she intended to let the matter rest. She had no evidence. Only suspicion. Yet suspicion has a curious way of growing when ignored. 1 month after Lady Margaret's death, Genevieve discovered the first inconsistency. Then another. Then another. Each one insignificant by itself. Together they formed a pattern. That was when the investigation truly began. Back in the present, Genevieve sat alone in her private sitting room studying documents spread across her desk. The fire burned low. Midnight had already passed. Most of the house slept. She unfolded one of the earliest letters again. The paper had aged slightly. The ink remained clear. 3 years of examination had revealed details she once overlooked. Tiny alterations. Subtle manipulations. Not enough to create scandal. Enough to create misunderstanding. Which was far more dangerous. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Enter. Theodore stepped inside carrying a candle. I knew I would find you awake. Genevieve smiled tiredly. You assume the worst of me. No. He glanced at the mountain of papers. I assume accuracy. Theodore crossed the room and examined the documents. You have been looking at these for years. Yes. And? Genevieve hesitated. Then she handed him one particular letter. Theodore read it carefully. His brow furrowed. I do not understand. Look at the signature. He examined it again. Sebastian's signature. Almost. Theodore looked up. Almost. Not quite. He frowned. Are you saying it was forged? Genevieve leaned back in her chair. I am saying someone wanted it to appear genuine. Theodore stared at her. Good God. That seems to be your preferred response lately. Because every conversation with you becomes more alarming. He lowered the letter. Does Sebastian know? No. Why not? Genevieve looked toward the fire. The answer was complicated. More complicated than Theodore realized. Because certainty matters. You already seem certain. No. She shook her head. I am convinced. That is different. Theodore studied her carefully. You still care what he thinks. The observation landed with uncomfortable accuracy. Genevieve did not answer immediately. Finally she said, that has never been the problem. Theodore's expression softened. Then what is? She looked down at the letter resting in her hands. The paper that may have altered the course of years. The paper that may have built walls where none should have existed. What if I am right? She asked quietly. Theodore blinked. Would that not be a good thing? Would it? Her voice softened further. Imagine discovering that years of distance came from manipulation rather than choice. Silence followed. Theodore understood immediately. If she was correct, then everything changed. Not just the investigation. Not just Victoria. The marriage itself. Upstairs, somewhere beyond the walls of the house, Sebastian remained awake as well. In his study, he stood before the fireplace holding a letter of his own. Not one of Genevieve's documents. A recent invitation. Yet he had been reading the same page for nearly 10 minutes without absorbing a word. His thoughts kept returning to her. To the conversation they had shared days earlier. To the strange certainty in her eyes. To the growing realization that he understood far less about his wife than he once believed. A sudden knock sounded at his door. Enter. Mr. Fletcher appeared. Forgive the interruption, Your Grace. What is it? A visitor called earlier this evening. Sebastian frowned. At this hour? No, Your Grace. During the afternoon. The butler hesitated. The gentleman left a message. Sebastian set down the invitation. Who was he? He declined to provide a name. Something about that answer immediately captured Sebastian's attention. What message? Mr. Fletcher handed him a folded note. Sebastian opened it. There were only 6 words written across the page. Ask your wife about Bath. His expression darkened instantly. Did anyone else see this? No, Your Grace. Sebastian folded the note slowly. Bath. The city where Lady Margaret Ellsworth had lived. The city Genevieve had visited repeatedly over the past 3 years. The city connected to questions he had never thought to ask. Downstairs, unaware of the message waiting in Sebastian's hand, Genevieve carefully returned the old letters to their box. 3 years of silence. 3 years of patience. 3 years of searching. And now, for the first time, someone else had entered the game. Someone who knew enough to be dangerous. Someone who knew enough to point Sebastian toward the truth. Or toward disaster. The difference depended entirely on what happened next. The next morning, Sebastian did something he had not done in years. He cancelled 2 meetings. His secretary looked mildly alarmed. Parliament matters were postponed. Estate correspondence remained unopened. Even the reports from Yorkshire stayed untouched upon his desk. None of them seemed important compared to the question now occupying his thoughts. Ask your wife about Bath. 6 simple words. Yet they had unsettled him more than any political dispute or financial challenge ever had. By noon he found himself standing outside the door of Genevieve's private sitting room. For several moments he simply looked at the polished wood. Then he knocked. "Come in." Her voice sounded calm. As always. Sebastian entered. Genevieve sat beside the window reading correspondence. Sunlight illuminated the room. A vase of fresh flowers stood nearby. The scene appeared peaceful. Yet he was beginning to suspect that peace around his wife was often an illusion. She looked up and smiled faintly. "You are avoiding your responsibilities." He blinked. "How do you know that?" "Because you never visit this room before luncheon." Despite himself, he almost laughed. "You notice everything." "Not everything." "Enough." She set aside her papers. "What is troubling you?" Sebastian closed the door behind him. "I received a message last night." Something changed in her expression. Not fear. Awareness. The sort of awareness one displays when a long-expected event finally arrives. "I see. Do you?" He studied her carefully. The message mentioned Bath. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable. Not hostile. Simply inevitable. Genevieve folded her hands in her lap. "Then perhaps it is time we spoke honestly." The answer surprised him. He had expected deflection. Questions. Evasion. Instead she appeared almost relieved. "About Bath?" he asked. "About many things." Sebastian crossed the room and sat opposite her. For the first time in years, neither title nor duty seemed present between them. Only 2 people attempting to understand each other. "Start at the beginning," he said quietly. Genevieve looked toward the window briefly, gathering her thoughts. Then she began. She told him about Lady Margaret Ellsworth. About the strange conversation 3 years earlier. About the letters. About the inconsistencies that had gradually become impossible to ignore. She did not reveal every detail. Not yet. Some evidence still required confirmation. Yet she revealed enough. More than enough. Sebastian listened without interruption. As the story unfolded, his expression grew increasingly serious. Several times he asked questions. Several times she answered. By the end, nearly an hour had passed. Silence settled over the room once again. Sebastian stared at the floor. Processing. Reconstructing years of assumptions. "You believed someone interfered with our correspondence." "I believed it was possible." "For 3 years." "Yes." He looked up. "Why did you never tell me?" The question carried no anger. Only genuine confusion. Genevieve lowered her gaze. "Because I was not certain." "You could have spoken to me." A sad smile touched her lips. "Could I?" Sebastian froze. The answer struck harder than any accusation. Because she was right. 3 years ago, he probably would not have listened. Not fully. Not carefully. Too many misunderstandings already existed between them. Too much distance. The realization left him unexpectedly ashamed. Genevieve continued softly. "I needed proof." "And now?" "Now I have pieces of proof." Her eyes met his. "Not all of it. But enough to continue." Sebastian leaned back slowly. Everything suddenly looked different. Not resolved. Not explained. Different. For years he had assumed the growing distance in their marriage came from inevitability. Personality. Circumstance. Time. Now another possibility existed. One far more unsettling. Someone may have helped create that distance. The thought refused to leave him. "Do you suspect Victoria?" he asked at last. Genevieve hesitated. "I suspect that many events seem to benefit her." It was not a direct answer. Yet it was answer enough. Sebastian stood and walked toward the window. Outside, carriages moved through the street below. London continued its ordinary routines while his understanding of the past shifted beneath his feet. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked quietly. "Because someone wanted you to know." She did not need to mention the note. They both understood. Sebastian turned back toward her. Something inside him had changed. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Yet the shift felt undeniable. For the first time in years, he realized how much she had carried alone. The investigation. The uncertainty. The burden of being doubted before she even spoke. And through all of it she had remained composed. Dignified. Patient. The realization filled him with a respect he could no longer ignore. Later that afternoon, London provided another reminder that patience was not always rewarded. Sebastian and Genevieve attended a charity exhibition in Kensington. The event attracted much of fashionable society. Painters displayed their work. Musicians performed. Guests circulated through elegant galleries discussing art with varying degrees of sincerity. The moment Sebastian and Genevieve entered, conversation shifted. He noticed it immediately now. The glances. The whispers. The curiosity. Previously he had dismissed such things. Today he paid attention. A group of ladies stopped talking as Genevieve approached. Another group resumed whispering the instant she passed. The pattern repeated throughout the afternoon. Eventually Sebastian overheard enough. She handled it well at the ball. Perhaps too well. Do you think she already knew? Everyone knows Victoria still loves him. The poor Duchess. The final comment lingered unpleasantly. Sebastian stopped walking. The women had not noticed him. They certainly had not noticed that Genevieve heard every word. Yet she continued forward without reacting. Exactly as she always did. For the first time, Sebastian found himself irritated. Not with Genevieve. With them. With all of them. They spoke about her constantly while understanding almost nothing. The unfairness of it struck him with surprising force. One of the women finally noticed his presence. Her face immediately turned pale. The group scattered moments later. Genevieve glanced toward him. "You frightened them." "Good." She looked mildly surprised. That was not a very diplomatic response. "I am not feeling particularly diplomatic today." Her eyes searched his face. Then something warm appeared in her expression. Not triumph. Not satisfaction. Something quieter. Appreciation, perhaps. The feeling unsettled him in ways he could not explain. The exhibition continued. Yet throughout the afternoon Sebastian remained unusually aware of his wife's experience. Every whisper. Every glance. Every assumption made at her expense. He noticed them all. More importantly, he noticed how often she endured them without complaint. By evening, another realization had begun to take shape. Genevieve was not merely surviving London society. She was protecting herself from it. The distinction mattered. Meanwhile, across the city, Victoria Holloway received troubling news. One of her acquaintances arrived shortly before dinner carrying fresh gossip from Kensington. Victoria listened carefully. Her smile gradually disappeared. "The Duke defended her?" she asked. Not directly. The woman hesitated. But he remained beside her throughout the event. Victoria looked away. The answer disturbed her more than she cared to admit. For years Sebastian had maintained emotional distance from everyone. Including his wife. That distance had always been useful. Predictable. Safe. Now it seemed to be shrinking. She did not like that. Not at all. That night, after returning home, Sebastian entered the library expecting to spend an hour reviewing correspondence. Instead, he found Genevieve asleep in a chair beside the fire. An open book rested loosely in her hands. Candlelight softened her features. For a long moment he simply stood there, watching. Not because she looked beautiful, although she did. Because she looked tired. Truly tired. The kind of exhaustion that came from carrying responsibilities nobody else could see. Slowly he crossed the room. Carefully he lifted the fallen shawl from the floor and draped it over her shoulders. The gesture took only seconds. Yet something about it felt significant. Genevieve stirred slightly but did not wake. Sebastian remained there longer than necessary. Longer than he intended. Then his gaze fell upon a folded paper resting beside her chair. A name was written across the top. Nathaniel Price. Sebastian froze. The same man connected to Bath. The same man connected to Lady Margaret. The same man connected to questions that now seemed larger than ever. He did not touch the document. He did not read it. Yet a strange certainty settled over him. The answers were close now. Closer than they had ever been. Unfortunately, so was the danger. Because somewhere in London, another person had begun asking questions as well. And unlike Sebastian, that person already knew exactly what was at stake. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning. It was delivered by special messenger, sealed in dark blue wax, and addressed in elegant script that immediately drew Genevieve's attention. She was seated in the morning room reviewing charitable correspondence when Mr. Fletcher presented it on a silver tray. This was delivered personally, Your Grace. Genevieve accepted the envelope. The seal belonged to the Royal Opera House. For a moment she simply stared at it. Then she broke it open. Theodore happened to be visiting again. He looked up from the newspaper he was pretending to read. That expression usually means trouble. Genevieve unfolded the invitation. You are becoming repetitive. I am becoming observant. She read the contents carefully. Once. Then twice. Theodore lowered the newspaper. Well. The Royal Opera is hosting a private gala next week. Theodore blinked. That does not sound particularly alarming. It is being sponsored by the Montrose Foundation. His expression immediately changed. Victoria's patrons. Exactly. Theodore stood. Then this is not an opera. No. Genevieve folded the invitation neatly. It is a stage. Theodore exhaled slowly. You think she planned it? I think nothing in London happens accidentally anymore. The answer lingered between them. Because both knew it was true. Throughout the season, every social event had become another move in a game that most people did not even realize existed. And now the game was moving toward a larger audience. Later that afternoon, Genevieve met Nathaniel Price once more. This time they gathered inside a discreet solicitor's office near Lincoln's Inn. Thick curtains blocked the street outside. The room smelled faintly of paper, leather, and dust. Nathaniel appeared unusually tense. The moment the door closed behind her, she understood why. There was someone else in the room. A woman perhaps in her late 50s sat quietly near the fireplace. She rose immediately when Genevieve entered. Your Grace. Genevieve studied her carefully. Have we met? No. The woman's voice trembled slightly. But I knew Lady Margaret. Nathaniel stepped forward. This is Mrs. Eleanor Finch. The name meant nothing at first. Then realization struck. Genevieve turned sharply toward Nathaniel. The companion. He nodded. Lady Margaret's former companion. For several seconds Genevieve simply stared. Mrs. Finch had disappeared nearly 2 years earlier. Every attempt to locate her had failed. Every inquiry had reached a dead end. Yet here she stood. Alive. Nervous. And very clearly frightened. You found her. Nathaniel's expression remained grim. No. He glanced toward the older woman. She found us. Silence followed. Genevieve sat slowly. Her pulse remained steady, but anticipation tightened inside her chest. 3 years of questions. 3 years of fragments. Perhaps at last they were approaching something solid. Mrs. Finch clasped her hands tightly. I should have come sooner. Why did you not? Genevieve asked gently. The woman looked down. Because I was afraid. No one spoke. Fear had become an increasingly familiar theme. Eventually Mrs. Finch continued. Lady Margaret suspected something before her death. Genevieve leaned forward slightly. What? Tears appeared in the older woman's eyes. She believed someone was intercepting correspondence. The room went silent. Nathaniel closed his eyes briefly. He had already heard this. Genevieve had suspected it for years. Yet hearing the words spoken aloud still carried enormous weight. Mrs. Finch continued. At first we thought it was a mistake. Then we realized the mistakes only seemed to affect certain people. Certain people? Genevieve asked. You. The Duke. Others connected to both of you. Genevieve felt a chill pass through her. The pattern she had suspected for years was slowly taking shape. Mrs. Finch reached into her reticule. Carefully she removed a folded document. Lady Margaret told me to protect this. Nathaniel accepted it first. Then handed it to Genevieve. Her eyes moved across the page. The handwriting belonged unmistakably to Lady Margaret. Several names appeared. Dates. Notes. Observations. Then one line caught her attention completely. Watch the opera box. Genevieve looked up immediately. The opera? Mrs. Finch nodded. Lady Margaret believed meetings were taking place there. Between whom? The older woman hesitated. She never knew for certain. Genevieve looked down again. Watch the opera box. Suddenly the invitation waiting back at Ashcroft House seemed far more significant. Across the city, Sebastian was having a conversation of his own. He had spent the previous several days quietly examining old records. Not because he doubted Genevieve. Quite the opposite. For the first time, he was beginning to believe her. That belief brought uncomfortable questions. He sat inside his study reviewing archived correspondence when Mr. Fletcher entered. Your Grace. Sebastian looked up. Yes? The butler appeared concerned. There was a gentleman asking questions outside the house this afternoon. Sebastian's attention sharpened instantly. Questions about whom? The Duchess. Silence settled immediately. What sort of questions? Mr. Fletcher chose his words carefully. Questions about her movements. Her visitors. Her schedule. Sebastian stood slowly. And who was this gentleman? No one recognized him. The answer disturbed him more than he expected. For several moments he said nothing. Then he walked toward the window overlooking the street. Below, London moved as always. Carriages. Pedestrians. Delivery wagons. Ordinary life. Yet suddenly none of it seemed ordinary. Someone was watching Genevieve. The realization produced an emotion he had not anticipated. Anger. Not dramatic anger. Not explosive anger. Something colder. Sharper. Protective. Mr. Fletcher waited quietly. Finally Sebastian said, if anyone asks similar questions again, I want to know immediately. Of course, Your Grace. After the butler departed, Sebastian remained by the window. 3 years. 3 years she had carried this burden largely alone. 3 years of investigations, suspicions, and unanswered questions. And now strangers were watching her. The thought sat poorly with him. Very poorly. That evening Genevieve returned home carrying fresh information and growing concern. She found Sebastian waiting in the library. The sight surprised her. He appeared to be expecting her. Something happened, he said immediately. She stopped. You first. The answer surprised him. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. Very well. Within minutes they were seated across from one another. For the first time in years, information flowed freely between them. No hesitation. No careful distance. No emotional barriers. Sebastian described the stranger. Genevieve described Mrs. Finch. Sebastian mentioned the questions. Genevieve revealed Lady Margaret's note. Gradually a larger picture began emerging. Neither liked what they saw. The opera box, Sebastian repeated quietly. Yes. You believe it matters. I believe Lady Margaret thought it mattered. Sebastian leaned back. Then we attend the gala. Genevieve looked at him carefully. You are certain? Completely. The answer came without hesitation. Something warm flickered briefly inside her chest. Trust, perhaps. Or partnership? She was no longer entirely certain where one ended and the other began. Sebastian reached for the document again. His eyes moved across the page. Then he froze. Genevieve noticed immediately. What is it? He did not answer right away. Slowly he pointed toward a name near the bottom of the list. Genevieve followed his finger. The moment she saw it, her breath caught. Not because the name was unfamiliar. Because it should not have been there. The individual in question had died nearly 4 years earlier. At least according to every public record in England. Yet Lady Margaret had written the name only months before her death. Sebastian looked up. Genevieve met his gaze. Neither needed to speak. They both understood the implication. If Lady Margaret was correct, someone connected to the entire scheme was still alive. More importantly, that person had been hiding in plain sight for years. Somewhere in London, the final missing witness still existed. And if they could find that witness before anyone else did, the truth might finally become impossible to silence. The night of the opera gala arrived beneath a sky the color of polished steel. London seemed unusually alive. Carriages crowded the streets leading toward the Royal Opera House. Lanterns glowed across the city. Elegant guests arrived in waves, filling the grand entrance with silk, velvet, diamonds, and carefully concealed ambition. For most attendees, the evening promised music, conversation, and spectacle. For Genevieve Ashcroft, it promised answers. She stood before the mirror in her dressing room while Hannah adjusted the final folds of her dark sapphire gown. The color had been Sebastian's favorite once. Years ago. Before misunderstandings had become habits. Before silence had become easier than honesty. You look magnificent, Your Grace, Hannah said softly. Genevieve smiled. You always say that. Because it is always true. Hannah stepped back. Though tonight feels different. Genevieve met her own reflection. How so? The maid hesitated. You do not look nervous. Genevieve's smile deepened slightly. Perhaps I am tired of being nervous. Downstairs, Sebastian waited in the entrance hall. The moment she descended the staircase, his attention lifted. For several seconds he said nothing. The silence was brief but unmistakable. Genevieve noticed it. So did he. Good evening, she said. Sebastian offered his arm. Good evening. They left together. As their carriage rolled through London, neither spoke much. Yet unlike previous months, the silence no longer felt empty. It felt occupied. Filled with shared purpose. Shared uncertainty. Shared determination. The Royal Opera House blazed with light when they arrived. Hundreds of guests moved through its magnificent entrance. Crystal chandeliers illuminated marble corridors. Music drifted from the orchestra tuning inside the auditorium. Everything appeared ordinary. Everything felt dangerous. Theodore met them shortly after their arrival. He looked unusually serious. You are both late. We arrived exactly on time, Sebastian replied. That is what I meant. Theodore glanced around carefully before lowering his voice. Nathaniel is here. Genevieve immediately understood. Did he find anything? Theodore nodded. Possibly. He handed her a folded note. She read it quickly. Then handed it to Sebastian. Only one sentence had been written. The witness has arrived. Neither spoke for several seconds. The witness. The missing piece. the individual Lady Margaret had believed still lived. Somewhere inside the opera house. Genevieve folded the note carefully. Do we know who it is? Theodore shook his head. Not yet. Then we keep watching. The gala began. Guests filled the auditorium while musicians performed selections from popular operas. Applause echoed through the hall. Conversation flowed between performances. From the outside, everything appeared perfectly normal. Yet Genevieve spent most of the evening observing rather than listening. She watched the private boxes lining the upper levels. She watched the guests moving through corridors during intermissions. Most importantly, she watched Victoria Holloway. Victoria occupied a private box sponsored by the Montrose Foundation. Exactly as expected. Elegant. Composed. Confident. She appeared entirely comfortable. Yet Genevieve noticed small details. The occasional glance over her shoulder. The slight tension in her posture. The growing awareness that something beyond her control was happening tonight. During the second intermission, Nathaniel finally appeared. He approached discreetly from a side corridor. Your Grace. What is it? Genevieve asked. Nathaniel's expression remained grave. We found him. Sebastian immediately stepped forward. The witness. Nathaniel nodded. Yes. Genevieve's pulse quickened. Where? Private Box 12. Nathaniel lowered his voice further. His name is Richard Harrow. The name struck Sebastian instantly. Impossible. Genevieve looked between them. You know him. Sebastian's expression darkened. He worked for my father. Nathaniel nodded. Exactly. Genevieve stared at both men. Suddenly the significance became clear. Richard Harrow had once managed portions of the Ashcroft estate correspondence decades earlier. More importantly, according to official records, he had died 4 years ago. Then who buried him? Theodore asked quietly. No one answered. Because nobody knew. Moments later, Genevieve found herself standing outside Private Box 12. The corridor remained empty except for a single attendant. Nathaniel approached first. He spoke quietly. The attendant nodded and opened the door. Genevieve stepped inside. The box was empty. For one terrible second nobody moved. Nathaniel looked stunned. Theodore swore under his breath. Sebastian crossed the room immediately. He was here. The attendant looked alarmed. Yes, Your Grace. Only minutes ago. Genevieve's eyes swept across the room. Empty chairs. Programs. A half-finished glass of wine. Someone had left in a hurry. Then she noticed a folded paper resting beside the chair nearest the railing. Slowly she picked it up. The handwriting was unfamiliar. The message contained only 8 words. She finally knows. Leave before she reaches you. Silence filled the box. Theodore read the note over her shoulder. Good Lord. Nathaniel looked genuinely shaken. Someone warned him. Or threatened him, Sebastian said. Genevieve stared at the paper. Victoria knew. The realization settled heavily inside her. Victoria knew they were close. Close enough to become dangerous. Close enough that someone had rushed to intervene. For several moments nobody spoke. Then Sebastian said quietly, the game has changed. Genevieve looked up. Yes. No more assumptions. His voice hardened. No more waiting. Something in his tone made Theodore glance toward him. The protective restraint Sebastian had maintained for years was beginning to crack. Not dramatically. Not recklessly. But undeniably. Before Genevieve could respond, movement in the corridor drew their attention. A servant appeared at the doorway looking pale. Your Grace. Genevieve turned. What is it? There has been an incident. The word immediately sharpened everyone's focus. What sort of incident? Sebastian asked. The servant swallowed. Miss Holloway wishes to make an announcement. Silence followed. Then Theodore blinked. An announcement. The servant nodded nervously. To the entire gala. Genevieve and Sebastian exchanged a look. Neither needed to speak. Victoria was making a move. Publicly. Which meant she believed she still controlled the narrative. Moments later the auditorium buzzed with renewed excitement. Guests returned to their seats. Whispers spread rapidly through the opera house. Anticipation filled the air. Victoria stood at the center of a gathering near the stage. Elegant. Smiling. Perfectly composed. Hundreds of eyes focused on her. Genevieve remained near the back of the crowd beside Sebastian. Nathaniel stood nearby. Theodore looked ready for disaster. Victoria raised her voice just enough to carry. Thank you all for your attention. The room gradually quieted. I wish to express my gratitude for the kindness London has shown since my return. Polite applause followed. Victoria smiled. Some friendships remain meaningful no matter how much time passes. Her gaze moved deliberately through the crowd. Then stopped. On Sebastian. Murmurs immediately spread through the audience. Victoria continued speaking. Every word sounded innocent. Every word carried implication. Genevieve listened carefully. So did everyone else. Yet something felt different now. The crowd no longer watched Victoria with unquestioning fascination. They watched her with curiosity. With caution. With doubt. Because too many questions remained unanswered. Too many strange events had begun surrounding her return. And for the first time all season, Genevieve realized something important. Victoria was no longer controlling the room. She simply had not noticed it yet. Then, across the crowded auditorium, Genevieve spotted a face she recognized from Lady Margaret's notes. The man stood near a side exit. Watching. Waiting. The moment their eyes met, he turned and disappeared into the crowd. Nathaniel saw him too. So did Sebastian. And suddenly all three understood the same thing at once. Richard Harrow had not escaped alone. Someone inside the opera house was helping him. Someone close enough to hear everything. Someone close enough to betray everything. And that person was still standing somewhere in the room. By the time the opera gala ended, nobody was thinking about music anymore. Guests left carrying rumors instead of melodies. Questions instead of memories. London had arrived expecting entertainment. It departed with uncertainty. That uncertainty worked entirely in Genevieve's favor. The following morning dawned cold and grey. Rain tapped softly against the windows of Ashcroft House. Genevieve sat in the library reviewing notes from the previous evening when hurried footsteps approached. The door opened without ceremony. Theodore entered carrying a folded newspaper and an expression of barely controlled excitement. We found him. Genevieve rose immediately. Richard Harrow? Theodore nodded. Nathaniel sent word less than 20 minutes ago. Her pulse quickened. Where? A boarding house near Whitechapel. Theodore handed her a note. He agreed to speak. For several seconds she simply stared at the message. 3 years. 3 years of searching. 3 years of fragments and dead ends. And now the witness was finally willing to talk. Before she could respond, another voice interrupted. Then we go immediately. Sebastian stood in the doorway. Neither had heard him arrive. Theodore smiled. I was hoping you would say that. Less than an hour later, the three of them sat inside a modest private parlor at the rear of a small boarding house. Nathaniel was already present. So was Richard Harrow. The man looked older than his supposed age. Thin. Nervous. Exhausted. Yet very much alive. The sight still felt strange. Officially, Richard Harrow had died years ago. Unofficially, he had been hiding in plain sight. Richard's hands trembled slightly as he looked around the room. I never wanted any of this. Nathaniel sat quietly. Genevieve remained calm. Sebastian's attention never left the witness. Finally Genevieve spoke. Then help us understand it. Richard closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, something had changed. Resignation, perhaps. Or relief. Lady Margaret was right. Silence settled instantly. Richard continued. Letters were altered. Theodore exhaled sharply. Nathaniel lowered his gaze. Genevieve remained completely still. The words confirmed years of suspicion. Yet hearing them spoken aloud carried enormous weight. Who altered them? Sebastian asked. Richard looked toward him. Guilt flashed briefly across his face. Not me. Then who? For several moments Richard said nothing. Then he whispered a name. Victoria Holloway. No one moved. No one spoke. The room became impossibly quiet. Richard continued before anyone could interrupt. Not directly. At first she paid others. Messengers. Clerks. Anyone who needed money. He swallowed hard. Small changes. Small delays. Small substitutions. Genevieve felt her heart pound once. Hard. Then again. Years of distance. Years of misunderstandings. Years of silence. All built from countless tiny manipulations. Richard looked toward her. I am sorry, Your Grace. She said nothing. Not because she was angry. Because she suddenly understood how much had been stolen. Richard continued speaking. Once he began, the words seemed unable to stop. He described forged correspondence. Intercepted messages. Carefully timed delays. Financial records. Payments hidden through intermediaries. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. Everything designed to create confusion. Doubt. Distance. Exactly as Lady Margaret had suspected. By the end of the explanation, Theodore looked stunned. Nathaniel appeared grim. Sebastian looked as though the ground beneath him had shifted. Then Richard revealed the final piece. She believed the Duke would eventually return to her. Genevieve lowered her gaze. Richard continued quietly. She said patience was all she needed. Sebastian's expression hardened. And you helped her? Shame filled the older man's face. At first I thought it harmless. Harmless? Theodore nearly exploded. Nathaniel placed a hand on his arm before the situation escalated further. Richard looked miserable. I was wrong. Yes, Sebastian said quietly. You were. Silence followed. Heavy. Uncomfortable. Honest. Eventually Richard reached into his coat and removed a packet of documents. I kept copies. Genevieve looked up immediately. Richard placed the papers on the table. Every transaction. Every payment. Every instruction. Nathaniel opened the packet first. His eyes widened almost immediately. Dear God. Theodore leaned forward. What? Nathaniel turned several pages toward them. There was no ambiguity. No uncertainty. Signatures. Dates. Financial records. Correspondence. Evidence. Real evidence. The kind that could survive public scrutiny. The kind that could not be dismissed as rumor. Genevieve stared at the documents. 3 years of questions had finally become answers. Across the table, Sebastian picked up one particular letter. The moment he saw the contents, his expression changed completely. Genevieve noticed immediately. What is it? He handed the page to her. Slowly she read. Then her breath caught. It was one of the missing letters. One she had never received. One Sebastian had written years earlier during the first difficult months of their marriage. Her eyes moved across the words. Every sentence felt like a ghost. Honest concern. Genuine affection. Vulnerability. Things she had believed absent. Things she had believed he never felt. Her vision blurred briefly. Not from tears. From shock. Slowly she looked up. Sebastian was already watching her. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. Years of misunderstanding stood between them. Yet suddenly they could see the shape of it. The truth had always existed. They had simply never received it. Theodore looked away discreetly. Even Nathaniel remained silent. The moment belonged to them. Finally Genevieve folded the letter carefully. I never saw this. Sebastian's voice was quiet. I know. Another silence followed. This one different from the others. Softer. Sadder. Yet somehow hopeful. Richard cleared his throat nervously. There is one more thing. Everyone turned toward him. Victoria does not know I kept copies. Nathaniel frowned. Are you certain? Richard nodded. Completely. A slow realization spread through the room. For the first time since her return to London, Victoria Holloway was vulnerable. Truly vulnerable. She still believed the truth remained buried. She still believed the narrative belonged to her. She was wrong. Very wrong. Hours later, as afternoon settled across London, word began spreading through society. Not the truth. Not yet. Something almost as powerful. Doubt. Questions emerged everywhere. Why had Richard Harrow reappeared? Why had Victoria become increasingly anxious? Why were old stories suddenly returning to conversation? By evening, the whispers had multiplied. Victoria noticed immediately. She sat alone in her drawing room listening as one of her acquaintances nervously repeated the latest rumors. With every sentence, her expression tightened. Who started this? She demanded. The woman shook her head. No one knows. Victoria rose abruptly and crossed toward the window. Outside, rain streaked the glass. Her reflection stared back at her. Calm. Elegant. Controlled. Yet beneath that composure, fear had begun to grow. For the first time, events were moving beyond her influence. For the first time, she could not predict what would happen next. Meanwhile, at Ashcroft House, Genevieve sat alone in the library holding the letter Sebastian had written years earlier. She had read it 4 times already. Each reading revealed another misunderstanding. Another lost opportunity. Another moment stolen before it could exist. A soft knock sounded. She looked up. Sebastian stood in the doorway. Neither spoke immediately. Then he crossed the room and stopped beside her chair. His gaze fell to the letter in her hands. I meant every word. The statement was simple. Honest. Years too late. Yet somehow exactly what she needed to hear. Genevieve looked up slowly. The distance between them no longer felt quite as impossible. Outside, London continued whispering. Inside, the truth had finally begun to emerge. And somewhere across the city, Victoria Holloway was discovering the most dangerous lesson of all. A lie can survive for years. But once the truth begins moving, it becomes almost impossible to stop. 3 days later, London received invitations that nobody could ignore. They arrived in aristocratic townhouses, country estates, gentlemen's clubs, and drawing rooms across the city. The sender was not a hostess seeking attention, nor a political figure seeking influence. The invitations bore the seal of the Duke and Duchess of Ashcroft. That fact alone ensured attendance. The wording was simple. A private evening reception at Ashcroft House. Important matters concerning recent public speculation would be addressed. By noon, the entire city was talking about nothing else. By evening, anticipation had reached extraordinary levels. No one knew exactly what to expect. Most suspected scandal. Few expected truth. Ashcroft House had never looked more magnificent. Every chandelier blazed with light. Fresh flowers filled the grand reception rooms. Footmen moved efficiently through corridors crowded with distinguished guests. Members of Parliament attended. Influential hostesses attended. Respected peers attended. Nearly everyone who mattered in London society eventually arrived. Genevieve stood beside a tall window in the drawing room shortly before the first guests entered. She wore ivory silk. Elegant. Understated. Calm. She looked exactly like a duchess should. Yet inside, emotions moved with unusual force. 3 years of questions were about to become public. 3 years of patience were about to reach their conclusion. A familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. "You are thinking too much." She turned. Theodore approached carrying 2 glasses of champagne. He handed one to her. "That is a dangerous observation." "It is an accurate observation." He studied her carefully. "Are you nervous?" Genevieve considered the question. Then nodded. "A little." Theodore smiled. "Good." She raised an eyebrow. "Good? It means you still care." Before she could respond, another voice joined them. "The guests have begun arriving." Sebastian stood nearby. Impeccably dressed. Composed. Yet Genevieve knew him well enough now to recognize the tension beneath the calm exterior. Theodore glanced between them and immediately stepped away. "I suddenly have important responsibilities elsewhere." Neither stopped him. Once they were alone, silence settled briefly between them. Then Sebastian spoke. "There is still time to cancel tonight." Genevieve looked surprised. "You would cancel it?" "If you wished." The answer came without hesitation. Her gaze softened. "No." She shook her head. "It is time." Sebastian nodded slowly. "Yes. It is." Their eyes met. For a moment neither looked away. So much had changed. Not only because of the investigation. Because of everything the investigation revealed. Misunderstandings. Lost opportunities. Feelings that had existed quietly beneath years of distance. Then the first guests entered. Reality returned. The evening began. Within an hour, every major room in Ashcroft House was filled. Conversations flowed. Music played softly. Yet beneath the surface, anticipation dominated everything. Everyone sensed something significant was about to happen. Even Victoria Holloway understood it. She arrived later than most guests. Deliberately. As she always did. Her entrance attracted attention immediately. Yet not the attention she once enjoyed. The atmosphere felt different now. Curious. Cautious. Several conversations stopped when she appeared. Others continued with forced politeness. Victoria noticed. Genevieve saw the realization in her eyes. For the first time all season, Victoria looked uncertain. Only briefly. Then the mask returned. Elegant. Controlled. Confident. She crossed the room gracefully. "Your Grace." Her smile appeared flawless. Genevieve returned it politely. "Miss Holloway." Sebastian remained beside his wife. The detail did not go unnoticed. Victoria certainly noticed. Her smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "A wonderful gathering." "Thank you. I was intrigued by the invitation. I imagine many people were." Another silence followed. Victoria seemed about to continue. Then she stopped. Because something had changed. Guests were no longer watching Genevieve. They were watching Victoria. The distinction mattered. Greatly. An hour later, Sebastian stepped forward to address the gathering. The conversations gradually faded. Hundreds of eyes turned toward him. The Duke of Ashcroft rarely spoke publicly without purpose. Tonight everyone knew a purpose existed. Sebastian stood beneath the central chandelier. Genevieve remained beside him. Nathaniel stood nearby. Theodore as well. Richard Harrow waited discreetly at the edge of the room. Most guests did not recognize him. Several soon would. Sebastian's voice carried easily through the silence. "Thank you all for attending." The room remained perfectly still. Recent months have generated considerable speculation. A ripple of uncomfortable amusement moved through the crowd. Understatement. London had practically built an industry around speculation. Sebastian continued. Many assumptions have been made. Many stories have circulated. His gaze swept the room calmly. Tonight we wish to address certain facts. Victoria's expression became very still. Genevieve noticed immediately. So did Nathaniel. The moment had arrived. Nathaniel stepped forward carrying a portfolio. Richard followed. Confusion spread rapidly among the guests. Whispers erupted. Several people recognized Richard. Their shock became visible immediately. Victoria's color faded slightly. Only slightly. Yet enough. Sebastian continued. For years, correspondence connected to my household was altered. The room went silent. Completely silent. Messages were intercepted. Documents were manipulated. False impressions were deliberately created. No one moved. No one spoke. The guests listened in stunned disbelief. Then Nathaniel began presenting evidence. Financial records. Copies of altered letters. Signed statements. Dates. Transactions. Facts. One after another. The presentation remained calm. Methodical. Impossible to dismiss. Every piece strengthened the next. Every explanation narrowed the possibilities further. Victoria stood motionless. Her expression remained composed through remarkable effort. Yet the confidence was gone. Completely gone. The room felt it. Genevieve felt it. Everyone felt it. Eventually Nathaniel reached the final documents. Richard provided his statement. The silence afterward seemed endless. Then Lord Hensley spoke from across the room. Are you saying this was intentional? Nathaniel answered simply. Yes. Another guest stood. For years? Yes. More whispers followed. More disbelief. More realization. The social tide had turned. Irreversibly. Victoria finally spoke. This is absurd. Every eye shifted toward her. She stepped forward. Surely no one believes this story. Her voice remained steady. Yet the strain beneath it had become obvious. Nathaniel calmly produced another document. Then another. Then another. Each one weakened her position further. Victoria looked around the room. Seeking support. Finding none. Because facts are difficult to argue with. Especially when hundreds of witnesses are watching. The room no longer belonged to her. It belonged to the truth. And everyone knew it. Then Sebastian did something nobody expected. He stepped away from the evidence. Away from the discussion. Away from Victoria entirely. Instead he turned toward Genevieve. The room fell silent once more. Slowly, deliberately, he crossed the distance between them. Every guest watched. Every guest understood the significance. Genevieve looked up at him. Uncertain. Surprised. For a brief moment, Sebastian seemed unable to speak. When he finally did, his voice was quieter than before. Yet somehow stronger. There is something else I need to address. No one moved. For years, my wife carried this burden alone. His gaze never left Genevieve. She searched for answers when others preferred assumptions. Silence deepened around them. She showed patience I did not deserve. Genevieve felt emotion tighten unexpectedly in her chest. Sebastian continued. And she demonstrated courage long before anyone recognized it. Several guests lowered their eyes. Because they remembered. They remembered the rumors. The gossip. The judgments. The pity. They remembered treating Genevieve as the woman being replaced. The woman being ignored. The woman losing. They remembered being wrong. Sebastian took another step closer. I should have listened sooner. The admission echoed through the room. Honest. Public. Unavoidable. I should have trusted more completely. Genevieve's eyes never left his. Neither did anyone else's. Then, before all of London society, Sebastian bowed his head. Not dramatically. Not theatrically. Simply sincerely. I owe you an apology, Genevieve. A collective breath seemed to pass through the room. Because everyone understood what they were witnessing. Not scandal. Not humiliation. Validation. Public. Undeniable. Complete. And for the first time since Victoria Holloway returned to London, every person in that room knew exactly who had truly won. The silence that followed Sebastian's apology lasted only a few seconds. Yet later, many people would remember it as the longest silence of the season. Hundreds of guests stood motionless beneath the chandeliers of Ashcroft House. Some looked stunned. Others looked embarrassed. A few appeared deeply thoughtful. London society had spent months discussing Genevieve Ashcroft. Judging her. Pitying her. Speculating about her future. Now those same people were confronting an uncomfortable reality. They had misunderstood the story entirely. Genevieve looked at her husband. For a moment the room seemed to disappear. The guests vanished. The whispers vanished. Even Victoria Holloway vanished. There was only Sebastian. The man she had married. The man she had spent years trying to understand. The man who had finally chosen honesty over pride. You do not owe me everything, she said quietly. Her voice carried farther than she intended. The room remained silent enough for everyone to hear. Sebastian held her gaze. Perhaps not everything. A faint smile touched his face. But certainly more than enough. Soft laughter rippled through the crowd. Not cruel laughter. Relieved laughter. Human laughter. The tension that had dominated the evening finally began to break. Genevieve felt her own smile appear. Small at first. Then genuine. The expression transformed her face. Theodore noticed immediately. So did Sebastian. For reasons neither could fully explain, that smile felt more significant than any speech delivered that evening. Across the room, Victoria Holloway stood utterly alone. No dramatic confrontation followed. No raised voices. No public spectacle. Somehow that made the outcome even more complete. One by one, guests stopped looking toward her. Their attention shifted elsewhere. To Genevieve. To Sebastian. To the future rather than the scandal. Victoria understood what was happening. Society could be unforgiving. Not because it enjoyed punishment. Because it enjoyed certainty. And tonight's certainty had arrived. The narrative she had carefully built for years had collapsed beneath the weight of truth. She remained perfectly composed. Elegant to the end. Yet the isolation surrounding her had become unmistakable. Eventually she gathered her gloves and quietly departed. Few people noticed. Fewer cared. Nathaniel watched her leave from across the room. Then he looked toward Genevieve. For the first time since they met, genuine satisfaction appeared on his face. Lady Margaret would have enjoyed this evening. Genevieve laughed softly. She would have corrected everyone's grammar before enjoying it. Nathaniel smiled. That as well. The gathering continued for another hour. Conversations shifted. New alliances formed. Old assumptions disappeared. Guests approached Genevieve repeatedly. Some offered congratulations. Others offered apologies. A few attempted awkward explanations for previous behavior. Genevieve accepted each interaction with grace. Not because she needed their approval. Because resentment no longer felt necessary. The truth had already done the work for her. Near midnight, the final guests began departing. Carriages lined the street outside. Footmen moved efficiently through the entrance hall. Gradually Ashcroft House grew quiet once more. Theodore was among the last to leave. He embraced his sister before stepping toward the door. I should probably return home. Probably. Though I dislike missing the ending. Genevieve smiled. The ending already happened. Theodore glanced toward Sebastian, who stood several feet away speaking with Nathaniel. Then he looked back at her. No. His grin widened. I suspect the ending is just beginning. Before she could respond, he bowed dramatically and disappeared into the night. Genevieve shook her head. Some things never changed. Half an hour later, the house had finally fallen silent. Servants cleared the last traces of the reception. Fires burned low in the drawing rooms. Outside, London rested beneath a sky filled with stars. Genevieve stood alone on the rear terrace overlooking the gardens. Cool night air brushed gently against her skin. The events of the evening replayed through her mind. 3 years. 3 years of questions. 3 years of patience. 3 years of believing that truth mattered even when nobody else seemed to care. And now it was over. At least the investigation was. Footsteps sounded behind her. She did not need to turn around. Everyone has gone home. Sebastian stepped beside her. Almost everyone. They stood in comfortable silence. Moonlight illuminated the gardens. Spring flowers swayed gently in the darkness. Somewhere in the distance, a clock struck midnight. A new day had begun. "How are you feeling?" Sebastian asked quietly. Genevieve considered the question. "Lighter. That seems appropriate." "And tired. That also seems appropriate." She laughed softly. The sound lingered between them. Neither seemed eager for it to end. Eventually Sebastian spoke again. "There is something I have wanted to say for a very long time." Genevieve turned toward him. His expression had become serious. Yet not guarded. Not distant. Honest. Entirely honest. "You can say it now." He nodded slowly. "I know." For several seconds he searched for the right words. Then he stopped searching. "I spent years believing I understood what happened to us." His voice remained calm. "I was wrong." Genevieve listened quietly. "I thought distance arrived naturally." He shook his head. "I thought silence was inevitable." The sadness in his expression was impossible to miss. "I never considered how much had been taken from us before either of us understood what was happening." Genevieve felt emotion tighten in her chest. Not pain. Not anymore. Something warmer. Something healing. Sebastian continued. "I cannot change those years." "No. But I would like to change what comes next." The words settled gently between them. Simple. Honest. Meaningful. Genevieve looked at him for a long moment. Then she smiled. "That sounds suspiciously like a second proposal." Relief appeared in his eyes, followed by amusement. "Does it?" "A little." Sebastian stepped closer. Not dramatically. Not urgently. Simply enough to close a distance that no longer belonged between them. "Then perhaps I should make it official." Genevieve's heartbeat quickened. "Perhaps you should." He took her hand. Warm fingers. Steady touch. Familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. Genevieve Ashcroft. His voice softened. "If given the opportunity, would you choose me again?" For one brief moment, tears threatened. Not from sadness. From the extraordinary weight of the question. Years ago she had married a duke. Tonight she was answering a man. The difference mattered. Very much. She looked into his eyes. Saw sincerity there. Saw regret. Saw hope. Most importantly, she saw love. Quiet love. Patient love. The kind that survives mistakes and misunderstandings and difficult years. The kind worth fighting for. "Yes," she whispered. Then she smiled wider. "Though next time I expect fewer intercepted letters." Sebastian laughed. A real laugh. Unrestrained. The sound made her heart ache in the best possible way. "That seems reasonable." "Good." Neither moved away. The garden remained silent around them. The city slept beyond the walls. The future stretched ahead. Uncertain, perhaps. But finally shared. After a moment, Sebastian lifted her hand and pressed a gentle kiss against her knuckles. The gesture was simple. Respectful. Full of meaning. Genevieve closed her eyes briefly. Not because the story was ending. Because it finally felt complete. The following weeks brought predictable consequences. Victoria Holloway quietly left London. Society quickly discovered new subjects for its attention. Nathaniel returned to his legal work. Richard Harrow provided additional testimony and disappeared into a much quieter life. Theodore continued offering opinions nobody requested. Ashcroft House remained exactly where it had always stood. Yet somehow everything inside it felt different. Months later, during a summer gathering in the countryside, Lord Hensley approached Genevieve while she stood beneath a flowering arbour. The elderly peer smiled knowingly. "You seem happy, Your Grace." Genevieve glanced across the lawn. Sebastian stood speaking with guests nearby. As if sensing her attention, he looked toward her. Their eyes met. The familiar warmth remained. Stronger now. Easier. Real. Genevieve smiled. "I am." Lord Hensley followed her gaze and nodded. "Good." Then he added quietly, "Justice does not always arrive quickly." Genevieve watched Sebastian begin walking toward her. "No." Her smile deepened. "But when it does, it is worth the wait." And for the first time in many years, there were no more questions waiting in the shadows. No more missing letters. No more hidden manipulations. Only truth. Trust. And two people finally choosing each other with open eyes. In the end, that proved far more powerful than any scandal London had ever imagined.